We're in the book of Proverbs. We're studying the subject of contention, violence, strife, that vein of Proverbs and that topic. And we've dealt with the problems with strife and violence, and we've dealt with how to avoid it. Really, essentially, there's a comparison made between foolishness and contention and violence and all of that. But now we're on this, that needs to be said before we do any of the stuff we're talking about now, because now we're talking about when it's right to fight, when it's right to have violence. And that has to be very carefully qualified, because obviously, ideally, there's no contention. Ideally, there's no violence. That's the world we're headed towards, the eternal kingdom of God, right? I mean, no wars, no fighting, no violence. But in this world that we live in, there are some appropriate times for contention, strife, and violence. We talked about several last week. Just to recap, we talked about several verses that deal with the subject of defense. It's not so much dealing, these verses, with the subject of self-defense, but rather defense of one's neighbor, which is a commandment in the Scriptures that we love others as our neighbors. And if we are neighbors to them, we should be willing to defend them if they are innocent and yet under assault by the wicked. So verses like Proverbs 12:6, the words of the wicked are to lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright shall deliver them. Proverbs 17:17, a friend loveth at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. When your brother is in adversity, that's why you're his brother, is to be there for him. Proverbs 24, if thou faint in the day of adversity, thy strength is small, if thou forbear to deliver them that are drawn to death. It is our job to be strong enough to help our neighbors who are innocent when they are under assault, whether that be a physical or a verbal contention sort of a thing. We talked about two from Proverbs 27, which probably fit better in the discipline category than they do in the defense category, but I suppose they also can work in the defense category. And last week we ended with those. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. So a friend, even when he wounds you, he's doing it for the right reasons, which can be considered defense or discipline, helping you learn things that you need to know. And then in the same vein, Proverbs 27, iron sharpeneth iron, so a man sharpeneth the countenance of his friend. And so we're going to find three categories of Proverbs here where it's right to participate in violence for a righteous cause. And the first one we're seeing is defense of the innocent. Secondly, we'll see discipline, or to help someone grow. Sometimes there's some violence, whether it's a verbal or physical violence that's actually required in certain cases, and we're going to talk about what cases and where that applies. And so that'll be, we have two more in the defense category, and then we'll get to stuff in the discipline category. I just say that to note that probably, as I think back, Proverbs 27, verse 6 and verse 17 probably worked better in the discipline category, and we're in the wrong category in my notes. That's my notes' fault. It's not my fault. So that's Alyssa's fault. No. Alyssa doesn't write my notes. She just tells me what should be in there. Proverbs 28. Proverbs 28, verse 4. Here's two more passages that go in the defense category. Verse 4 says, they that forsake the law praise the wicked, but such as keep the law contend with them. Here's a contention that is positive. It is positive to contend with wicked people. And in this case, the way in which you can contend with... Now, the proverb operates on the assumption that we recognize that it's right to contend against wicked people. If they're wicked, you should be against them. Otherwise, you're for them, and then you're wicked too, right? So you should be resisting wickedness. That should be regular. That's assumed here in this proverb. The point of the proverb assumes that there's contention, that we ought to have with the wicked. And because of that assumption, here's how you do that. Here's how you contend with the wicked. It's not by forsaking the law. If you forsake the law, you're essentially telling wicked people they're right, they're doing good. So when you disobey the law, you're telling other disobeyers of the law that they're right. You're praising the wicked. But when you keep the law, you are, by your very actions, contending with them. Now, keep in mind, this is specifically talking about the law of God, right? Now, it's not that it couldn't apply to the law of man, right? But the law of God is what differentiates between a wicked and a righteous person. The law of man, in most cases, should differentiate between a wicked and a righteous person, but not always, right? There are times when man's law do not line up or are even contrary to God's law. But specifically, in a perfect system where the law is perfect, like the Old Testament, then those who say, well, this law is not that big of a deal, I'm not going to follow this one, you're really siding with the people who break the laws that you think are a big deal. And if God gave the instruction and we say it's no big deal, we're not going to follow it, we're lending credence to those who say, it's no big deal, I'm not going to follow it, about all the other things that we're like, well, you shouldn't do that. And this is really the nature of man. We pick and choose. The laws that we like that God has given us, we want to follow those, and we want to say, look at how bad you are for not following these laws. And then the ones we don't like, we say, well, God surely didn't mean that. It's obvious. When he says, look, let no guile be found in your mouth, I mean, surely he doesn't mean little white lies, right? Well, of course he does, right? So I think that speaks to the state of man. The way to contend with the wicked, one effective way to contend with them, is by being righteous yourself and actually following the commandments of God. What are your thoughts on that one?
And they know you're a Christian. What is that going to say to them? Is that how Christians behave? I always remember Pastor Matt telling me that, and it's people know you're Christians and they see you, and then it's very important that we all try to be the best that we can when people are looking at us.
Yeah, there's definitely something to be said for the following of God's commandments openly, so that people see that you're doing what is right, not for vainglory.
I can't help but say, I mean, she's right. That, the issue with appearances is just, it's incredible. But isn't it also kind of sad?
Yes.
That you forgo a situation like that because you have a need, because people are so quick to jump to conclusions and make their own little, observation without a proper investigation, or a simple question, is everything okay? Type thing.
Right. Yeah, that's true. That is true. Yeah.
And I've had discussions about choose to be defrauded rather than I have a right, I can have somebody rent from me, that there's no problem with that, but choose to give up something even to your detriment for the sake of the gospel. And then the idea of don't let your good be evil spoken of.
Yeah.
Well, it may have been okay, but it's like people are going to speak evil against you, well, then I'll choose to be defrauded rather than do those things.
So this subject here that the last three comments here have been about is it's worthy of a lot more discussion. But I feel that if we did, we'd be so far off from. So I'm trying. It's not that I think you guys are making really good points, and I don't want to take away from those. But just so that way we don't get too far off, we'll move on to the next one. How about that? But that's good. I think there's at least a sense here that if you're going to be contending with the wicked by doing what is right, there is at least an implication that it's going to be obvious that you're doing what's right. You're not going to be hiding in the back doing what's right. You're going to be doing what's right in front of people. So, but there's a whole discussion about, well, it's just about what's in my heart. Well, how are you portraying yourself? And man, I could see a whole series on that. And series are 2 years long here. So, but that's very, very, very interesting discussion. Let's do Proverbs 29, verse 9 and 10. These are not one proverb. In fact, one of them shows a little bit of a different side, but they look like two proverbs that just happen to be grouped together, at least in my opinion. Here's what it says in verse number 9 of Proverbs 29. If a wise man contendeth with a foolish man, whether he rage or laugh, there is no rest. Now, what seems to be agreed upon by commentators here is that when it says whether he rage, it's talking about the foolish man. So if a wise man is contending with a foolish man, the foolish man is going to do one of two things. He's going to get angry, and you're not going to accomplish much. Or he's just going to mock, and you're not going to accomplish much. This reminds us, now, Proverbs will often remind you of the words of Jesus. There's a reason for that, right? Because he's the wise fulfillment of the picture that Solomon was. He's the wise son of David that Solomon was a picture of the Messiah as Jesus. So you're going to see a lot of that, especially in the Sermon on the Mount. And what was it that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount? Don't cast your pearls before swine. There is a time when valuable judgments, that was in the context of judging, valuable judgments, this is wrong, you shouldn't do that, is going to be like taking a precious pearl and putting it in front of a swine, who all he wants is stuff to eat, right? And he can't eat a pearl. It's one of the only things swine don't eat, I suppose, because they eat a lot, right? But they can't eat pearls. And so I think that seems to be a view here in verse 9. If a wise man contends with a foolish man, it doesn't really matter if that person is a man without understanding, but he has wisdom, he will grow in understanding, right? He might not be a smart person. That's not what it's saying. It's talking about wise and foolish. This person, when you begin to try to give them instruction, they will not receive it because they're foolish. Not they're lacking information, they're lacking motivation. They don't desire to serve God. They don't desire to do what is right. And so then often what will be the case is that they're going to either respond by mocking you or getting angry at you, but it's not going to accomplish their betterment. And so we have that. That seems to be on the discipline side of things, but I included it in here because in verse 10, it seems to be on the defense side. Look at verse 10. The bloodthirsty, that would be those who want to murder or commit violence, hate the upright. Boy, we've seen that this year, haven't we? I mean, just politically, but the just seek his soul. In other words, there's this upright man, and then there's two people that are interacting with the upright. The bloodthirsty, or the evil, the fools, right? They're bloodthirsty. They hate the upright. They hate this upright person. But a just person looks out and finds an upright person and says, I want to find him. I want to seek his soul. I want to protect him. I want to defend him. Those kind of attitudes. So verse 10 seems to be about defense. Verse 9 seems to be about how do you discipline somebody? How do you take them from foolish to wise? And so you have these two different things being talked about. What are some of your thoughts on either of those two as we've been discussing them?
When you're in, like you were in a barbershop, but when you're in a group, there may be both of those types of people in there. The ones who are wise but lack knowledge, and those who are not wise, they're foolish and have no motivation and will mock or whatever. So, being able to, pivot to the one that you think will gain and, try to deflect from the one who's running their mouth or whatever. Just being able to pivot. If you're not used to it and you don't practice there is something to be said for, it flustering the person, but,
Yeah.
sometimes the Lord allows you to be able to pivot to the one that you think will be worthwhile. I don't know.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think these proverbs are written so that you will grow in wisdom, so that you recognize this. You're in the middle of a conversation. You have genuine motives, trying to help a person, and you start seeing it going towards anger or wrath, and you can see, okay, this is not going to lead towards anything good. There's going to be no peaceful resolution of this. This doesn't seem to be helpful. So I'm going to back out of here. And using wisdom to know when that is the case and when that maybe this can still be helpful. Yeah. De-escalation. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that second one deals with the defense, right? You want to defend the upright. So there is a right time for violence. Although notice that the instigator isn't the just one in verse 10. The just is going to the defense of the upright, where the bloodthirsty, the ones who instigate violence, are the ones that are in the bad camp. And we should see violence as a way to jump in and defend an innocent person. So there's our first category, defense. Now, we've already done several on discipline, so let's just keep going right in that vein. But we're going to go back to the beginning of Proverbs, because that's the order I put them in. So Proverbs chapter 3 and Proverbs chapter 7. Now, the reason I'm going to read these two together and then get comments on them is because this is all in that opening introductory sermon to the book of Proverbs, chapters 1 through 9. And so there are Proverbs, pieces of nuggets of wisdom that are worked into the sermon, but as part of that sermon. And you'll find here that this is making a few assumptions about some scenarios where it is good to have violence without actually telling you this is good. It's just assuming that you already know this. So I'll point those out, and then we'll get to Proverbs 10 and work piece by piece through those. In Proverbs 3, there's a statement at verse 11. He's talking about the Lord. He says, "My son, despise not the chastening of the Lord," meaning the Lord will bring disciplinary scenarios into our lives that will cause us to grow if we respond correctly, that will help us to be more like what he wants us to be more righteous. But he's telling his son, don't despise those. Don't get upset at God when he's bringing corrective things into your lives. Neither be weary of his correction. Then verse 12 makes this thing that's just saying, you should know this because, for whom the Lord loveth, he correcteth, even as a father the son in whom he delighteth. Understand that there was no debate in Solomon's time about whether or not a father should correct his children. That was not that's a modern debate. Oh, you shouldn't spank your kids or whatever. That was not an ancient debate. Okay, that nobody had a question over whether that was okay. So he's drawing on the assumption that it is right for a father to correct his child. Therefore, it's right for God to correct you. So there's an assumption there. And now we can talk about what that correction looks like. Obviously, when we're talking about correction, there are things to be concerned about where parents have physically harmed their children in a manner that's not connected with their actual betterment. So we'll probably get more into that as we go further. I don't know if we'll have time to get into it today. But that is at least assumed that a father or parents have the right and the responsibility, of course, to correct their children. And it was on that basic assumption that you have the Lord's correction being argued for. Now look at Proverbs 7. This is, if it's possible, more controversial today, but also just assumed back then. Look what it says in Proverbs 7, verse 22. Again, he's making a different point, but I want to point out an assumption that something that he just assumes that you agree with. in verse 22. He's talking about the man who's going after foolishness like a man who goes after a strange woman, a harlot on the street corner. And it says this, he goeth after her straightway as an ox to the slaughter, or as a fool to the correction of the stocks. He just says, you guys all slaughter oxen, right? Surprise, surprise, all the PETA people, you know. Yeah, of course we do. And you all put fools in stocks when they're being fools. So there's a assumed scenario where people are being bound and put in chains because of their foolishness. Now I like how the King James translates this as stocks, although the word just means something tied around the ankle in Hebrew. It's obviously, it could be what we imagine when we think of stocks. The Old English word stocks would refer to that. It's not really a torture device. It's just a punishment device where they would, sometimes it would be their feet would be in these big wooden stocks. And in other cases you might see where their hands and their head are in the stocks, and they're left there for maybe an hour, or like in extreme scenarios, maybe for a whole day. And obviously it's extremely embarrassing and painful, and it was a way to help somebody who was foolish to stop being so foolish. like something for disciplinary purposes. But today we often think that would be terrible. You can't take a prisoner and do anything that's like bad for them. It's just a shame that they have to be behind bars, let alone that you would make them be in any kind of physical pain. In fact, there's a lot of people who want prison reform, and what they mean by prison reform, for many people, is nobody should be in prison. You know? It's like, well, wait a minute, somebody should be in prison. I mean, it's there for a reason. So there is a now. It's important that we think, when we're thinking about disciplinary things, that we don't forget the fact that there's also justice, and those are two different things. Again, in our society, we think that prisoners should go into prison so that they can become better people and come out and re-enter society. Well, that's the discipline side of things. Although they often think they become better people by, therapy and just being nice to them or something like that. I don't know. I've not been in a prison, but I've heard those type of comments before. But we're also forgetting that there's another thing, and we'll get to this further on down the road, and that is justice. It's not just to see the person become disciplined and become a better person. They also need to get what is right for them to receive in response for their actions. There's a justice that's required by God's law, and I think we ought to require it in our society as well. But at any rate, these two things at least assume the idea that it is normal to use what we might consider extreme measures to help someone become a better person, to help them grow, to sharpen iron with iron, if you will.
How many lives have been turned around because of a simple but embarrassing way of accepting correction? And to do that, a lot of people have probably spent many years in jail, hidden away from someplace where the public doesn't see them.
Yeah. I think embarrassment is a really key factor in helping people realize the error of their ways. And one of the things that is, ironically, the word that's coming to me, the thing that is a shame, is the fact that we don't have shame. That in our society it's like, oh, you shouldn't feel bad, or it's not your fault, it's some disease, you're diseased, and they'll try to come up with all these explanations to keep someone from being ashamed. Well, that's probably added to a lot of what we're dealing with in our society, because people ought to be ashamed of behaviors that are shameful. Right? Yeah. So those are the two introductory things. Let me give you just one more verse, and then I'm sure there might be other things on the introduction. We'll go to Proverbs 10, verse 13. This really goes on that. This is something that if you were to say, let's do this in the prisons today, there would be an outrage. I promise you would not win any elections. But here's what it says. Verse 13, in the lips of him that hath understanding wisdom is found, but a rod is for the back of him that is void of understanding. Like, how dare you even read that verse? It's there, okay? And this is what they did often, because they didn't have prisons in the Old Testament law. There was no prison. So if you didn't do something worthy of death, you would bring a sacrifice or something like that. Or if it's a lesser thing, in order to correct, what would they do? Well, they would take a rod to you, right? As a matter of fact, they had a limit to how many times they could beat you. And Paul was beaten a lot of times, up to the limit by the Sanhedrins that he went to, the Sanhedrins over the different synagogues that he went to. So Paul was beaten with a rod. I think it was 30. Is it 39 times? 40 times minus 1? Yeah. Yeah. And so the idea that was just assumed in those days is an effective way to help someone to not be foolish anymore is to beat them. And now I understand how that is and I understand why that's offensive, right? Because we are very aware of times where that can be abused, right? That can become abuse. That we as Americans recognize we don't trust our government enough to use that kind of power. I mean, I don't trust the government not to use that on Christians or on righteous people, right? So I understand that, and I get why we're instinctively against that. But at its heart, the principle isn't wrong. The principle of saying there is some, even physical violence, that could be a positive thing if used correctly and used with wisdom, and could actually help an individual who's foolish to grow, because it doesn't do permanent damage to them, but it does change their mind in a more permanent way. That's a positive way of using violence. And you can even apply that to rough, talk. Anyone who's raised sons should probably know this, I'm sure, that sometimes you just got to sit down and just have a man-to-man conversation and just be a little rough with that son, because they're going down a path that if you're not rough with them about it, they're going to think this is okay. They need some harsh talking to. I'm not personally. I haven't experienced that at all. I'm looking at my two sons, of course I have. But so I think that's. What are some other thoughts that you had on that?
When I said almost 100%, the ones who are not in this category, it's just dawned on me, they're ones who come from India, China. When they come in to serve a sentence, when they come into jail, they are very respectful and quiet, and you can see the remorse in their faces.
Yeah.
Interesting, because they grew up in a society that is probably a little more like this in their handling of bad behavior
Right.
than we are in the United States.
This in countries in Asia, this is very normal. This kind of reaction to and really it also speaks to justice as well, right? Because if somebody has harmed another individual, but they're treated with kids' gloves, maybe they've beaten up on somebody and, they're bloodied and in the hospital for weeks or whatever. And then the perpetrator of that crime is taken to a prison and handled with kids' gloves and given therapy and all this stuff, given free meals every day, and then sent back out into society. You got to ask yourself, what kind of justice is that? Here's the innocent guy gets beaten up and the other guy gets treated with kid gloves, and guess what? It's not going to be all that long before he's back in the prison again, because that stuff doesn't work, right? And so I think there's some wisdom for our society. I think there's also some wisdom for us personally too, just to recognize that there are times when harshness and contention, if carefully calculated and used with the right motive for the purpose of discipline and growth, can be helpful. It's got to have, this is something you have to be wise with, because obviously we've already studied all the times when it's wrong to have contention, and it's very easy for us to be filled with pride and to use, especially as men, it's almost a natural response to things we don't like that we want to, by force bring them in. And so for a man to use correction, let's say, on his children, and not be careful and cool and level-headed and calculated about it, it can very easily become abuse, right? So that's something we have to be careful about. But it's at its principle, it's not wrong. The basic principle here of using that for correction is not wrong. Yes?
So wrongful actions should have consequences. So back many moons ago, when the military was more apt to take care of things in their own way, our saying was, if you want to be stupid, you got to be tough. Because you've got consequences. And we would remind each other of those things if we saw something. We're like, all right, go ahead, but if you're going to be stupid, you got to be tough.
You know, I think this is maybe the third week in a row that someone's used a quote from the military. And it's so applicable here. And I really wish that our society, especially the men in our society, were more familiar with the way the military used to operate. You know, I think it was a very effective, especially it was effective at raising up strong, masculine men. And that's why they did it the way that they did it. That's why the military operates the way that it does, or did. I don't know if it still does. But the reason was because it's going to produce that masculine element that we need in our military. And I think we're missing that a lot in our society, and part of it is because we don't have that kind of attitude in child rearing either. Not to say that we need to be, a military in how we raised our children. I'm just saying there are some things to think about that are positive elements that we can use. Yeah.
I was just going to say, as a teacher, I've noticed parents making, they make excuses for their kids' behavior now rather than disciplining and dealing with it. And I teach in a Christian school where it's not that bad, but I also have friends who teach in public school, and parents just they almost attack the teacher for bringing the bad behavior to their attention.
Yeah. Being a husband of a teacher has opened my eyes just in talking with her about just even in a Christian school how bad the child rearing situation is in our country. I mean, even in a Christian school, there is a real lack of discipline. Now, not all. We're going to talk more about it when we get to things like. We'll use the word a rod only on his son. The Proverbs 13. He that spareth the rod hateth his son. And we'll talk about this. And I think we'll get into the details about when this is necessary. Some sort of physical response to an action ought to be a more extreme scenario, and it should be calculated with the individual child as to what will help them grow. So obviously that's key. But the idea that parents, I think I think most parents in these days are just lazy. I think it's laziness. I don't think it's, I just love my kid too much. No, because you're screaming and yelling at him. But you're screaming and yelling at him because you're annoyed that he's bothering you with whatever wrong thing he's doing. Not because you actually care to help him grow to be the person he ought to be. And so if you're actually saying, I'm going to work hard at thinking through how to help this boy or girl become the servant of God that they need to become and develop the type of characteristics they need, that takes work. It takes individual approach with different children. It takes a lot of things that most parents aren't willing to put in. Because where do we start with the selfishness comment earlier? That's really where our society is. It's all about me. And so my kids, great, I have kids. That's wonderful. So I can post pictures of them on Facebook and whatever, all the fun things about having kids. But when it comes down to their discipline, I just don't want to have to worry about it. That's the reason why some parents abuse their kids. And that's the reason why some parents do nothing at all for discipline. Often both of those boil down to laziness. That seems to me like a good place to leave it. There's a lot more to be said, and we will continue to say it, but that's a good place to pause. We'll pick up from there next week. I have probably at least a few more weeks in the discipline section, so we'll have a lot more to say. And a lot of it will be about children, disciplining children, because of course, where is that a greater place to apply the concept of discipline than the responsibility a parent has to raise their children? I mean, it's just so important. So we'll cover that over the next several weeks, and then we'll get to the subject of justice, which I have so many verses on violence as it applies to justice, not discipline, not defense, justice. And this is a very interesting concept. I can't wait to get to it. But we're probably looking at 2025 before we get there. Let's just be honest. All right, let's pray. Our Father, we thank you for your goodness. Thank you for the wisdom that you give us in these verses, and for the opportunity that you've given us as a church family to sit around and to chew on these verses and to let them sit in our mind. Help us to grow in these areas. Help us to consider these things very carefully, knowing that in general, contention, violence, strife is not something we should be a part of or seeking out, but also recognizing where there is some value in defending or helping someone grow through discipline. So help us to be very careful and calculated and wise with these matters or with this subject. I regret the times in my life when I've read through the book of Proverbs and applied concepts from it without using any wisdom. And I think we can all recognize how desperately we need to carefully think about these things, not just use them to support things we already believe. But Lord, I pray that you'd help us now as we continue to think about these, that we wouldn't just have them in our minds, but they would produce a change in our actions, that they would be applied to our lives. We pray these things in Jesus' name.